I suggest, therefore, that this be solved not through a democratic process. That would take too long and devour far too much of the funds to educate the cannon fodder, unfortunately, which populates the earth. We have to take almost an elitist program that we can see beyond our swollen bellies and look to the future in time frames and in results which are not easily understood or which can be, with intellectual honesty, be reduced down to some kind of simplistic definition.
Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Windows Towers. We've got a very interesting show tonight, and it does back up a lot of the stuff we've been putting out recently and the mindset which has been inflicted on us. And just to get the show started, I thought I'd play you that clip. We did a show a few weeks ago, and it was called The Man Who Saw the Future. And the man who saw the future in 1987 was a businessman called George Hunt. And George Hunt outlined what happened at the World Wilderness Conference of 1987. The person you heard speaking at the beginning there was a Canadian investment banker called David Lang. He was describing how this new environmentalism mixed with development, which became known as sustainable development, would be rolled out. In other words, it had to be rolled out in a simplistic way, and it had to be rolled out in a way which would engage the public. And you can tell by the way David Lang was speaking there what he actually thought of the public. First of all, though, I just want to get into some recent shows we've been doing. And I've been doing a lot of live streaming. So do go to windowsontheworld.net, check the shows out. Thanks to An Irish Perspective, Kieran Boyle. I had a great chat the other night, and please go to Kieran's YouTube channel. Also, Eric Von Essex, we've been looking into how global goes into local and other things. And I'm really enjoying doing these. Do support us on Patreon, and I've got a very funny story about the big green ego problem tonight, which is actually the title of the show. And as the show goes on, you'll understand why that is. We're talking about people who are green in the respect that they're arrogant and gullible, but they pose as environmentalists. And those are the sort of people that David Lang was referring to, the cannon fodder, the people that they would use to get their agenda across. And we're doing some talks. Please check windowsontheworld.net for the dates of the talks. Next Saturday, I will be in Manchester. On the 25th, we'll be in Fairbourne. Now, I want to get on with the show because I've got quite a lot to get into. And yes, first of all, you heard David Lang, the Montreal investment banker. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that these globalists, these people who are holding the purse strings of these investment banks and even the World Bank, we've got Mark Carney there now, these people are working with other people who think very big. And these people who think big can actually implement these strategies as policy because they have that power. That power came from environmentalism, the use of environmentalism to get the public to agree to be controlled and managed and reduced in population size. Now, all of this came out of documentation, which you can look up online, and we have covered in our talks called The Bigger Picture, also known as the Real People's Assembly. I've been talking about this for a long time. I've got all the evidence to back it up. Yet, isn't it strange, when you present the general public with evidence, they will accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist because that's what the education system has told them to do. They will accuse you of being far right because that's what the media have told them to do. And they will then ridicule you because the fear within them that the state could possibly be lying to them has to be overridden. These are the sort of the three stages which it goes through. And I've been studying this for a long time. But yes, good evening, everybody on Spaceship Earth, Mother Gaia, Earthlings and communitarians, and also, of course, yes, I'm talking about you, the listener, the people with a brain cell. We are talking here about the big ego problem tonight, the big green ego problem. Green meaning, in this case, arrogant and gullible. The Big Green Ego Problem is a look at the ambitions of the globalists and their global followers working on behalf of the World Bank. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that globalisation is all about controlling the opposition and leading it, which is where Extinction Rebellion come in. Extinction Rebellion's aims, in particular, are the destruction of Western democracy, because they see this as inevitable. What will come out of that is this new form of totalitarianism, and that's really what the Green Agenda is all about. We've done many shows on this, and our show, Extinction Rebellion, The Facts, has had quite a lot of listeners. And if you go to windowsontheworld.net, you will find a lot of other shows linked to that Extinction Rebellion, The Facts, and how all of this globalization goes into the so-called green movement and what the green movement's really about. But let's go back to 1987 and that conference where David Lang was speaking. The conference was set up by an oil billionaire. Now, this is hilarious because when you tell the public that it's an oil billionaire who funded the green movement, they will say you are a right-wing conspiracy theorist, or that you believe that Elvis lives on the far side of the moon, or even worse than that, you voted Brexit. Now, this is really funny because I did a show with Richie Allen last week, and I outlined how this kind of mentality works. In other words, you present people with a fact and you go into a bigger picture. They fail to join the dots, and then they assume that you voted Brexit and you're Boris Johnson's best friend. Now, this, of course, is the system of parties. You get people arguing over things of no importance, like left and right, because global governance is above left and right. Nobody who is actually putting these policies into governments around the world gives a damn about who's in power. And that is something that the ego problem Greens have a huge problem with it, because they think they're worthy left-wingers. Well, worthy left-wingers were kicked out of the Labour Party by certain lobbying groups a long time ago and up until recently, of course. So let's go back to 1987 and what David Lang was actually talking about. He was talking about setting up a thing called a Global Environmental Facility. Let's just see what it says on the World Wilderness Congress website. Now, bearing in mind, the next World Wilderness Congress event is very soon. It's this year in India, in Jaipur. Wild 11. Go and check the website. When I put that out to people who'd been to the World Wilderness Conference over the past few years, and I said, did you know that the UN plans to take stewardship of 50% of the Earth's oceans and seas this year? They said, I know people who've been there and they've never talked about oil billionaires. Well, I'm afraid that an oil billionaire set it up. Yes, through the United Nations Environment and Development. So, this was Maurice Strong, an oil billionaire who set up the United Nations Conference on Environmental Development, which became the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. This was after the World Wilderness Congress of 1987. And this event catalysed the Green Globalist Action Plan. The action plan which the Green Globalists, the ego-centric Green Globalists, will refuse to admit even happened. They will refuse to admit that policies coming from the likes of Edmund de Rothschild, Maurice Strong, and others are now implemented in their local areas. They will refuse to believe that because they cannot join dots and fail to read documentation. Their appeal to authority is all they have. Things like 97% of scientists agree. And of course, the appeal to the wiping out of humanity because of CO2, which is 0.04 of 0.04% of the atmosphere, according to the UN, who couldn't be trusted to help you cross the road. Look at their history. Look at the history of the UN. It's a lawless organisation which was set up as a new global government who are above international law. Well, they're above all law. In actual fact, it's in their charter. Go and read it. But the Fourth World Wilderness Congress convened in September 1987, Denver, Colorado, with 2,000 delegates from 64 countries. Proceedings, let's see what they said. For the conservation of Earth, proposed the establishment of a World Conservation Bank or Fund, the first call for new conservation finance mechanisms, which eventually led to the $1.1 billion Global Environment Facility. Now, when you put this in front of the big green egos, they go a bit mental. We've covered all this recently. It's a good example of how the public cannot understand the basics of environmental banking or globalism. Remember, environmental banking is sustainable development, which is your local council policy. Sustainable development is a mixture of environmentalism on the one hand, which is the water, and development on the other side, which is the finance and the banking. The banking leads the way because fire always takes precedence over the water. However, the synchronicity, the synthesis of these two things, fire and water, are the old Rosicrucian fantasy of this synthesis, which everything is going to be put into a huge pot of accepted public opinion and belief, which they have been mentoring the public into for a few hundred years at least. But let's keep it recent, because the globalist, anti-globalists, the puppets of the globalists, will start saying it's a conspiracy theory and put their fingers in their ears. But remember, globalists think big. The big green egos think very small, usually just about as far as the end of their noses. And that's just to do a bit of virtue signalling. But the new Global Environmental Facility was set up at that conference and there for them all to read. And I'm going to get into how the public react to this when you put some information in front of them. So I think this is part of it. This is a psychological warfare program, and it's been thought out very carefully. And a lot of these fake greens will say, this is really negative. No, what you're doing is really negative, because what you're doing is taking away the freedoms of everybody else on the back of a huge lie, that carbon dioxide is somehow driving global temperature. Well, that's an interesting one. We're going to get into that as the show goes on. But when I posted up this year that the UN, the World Bank and the Global Environmental Facility under the World Bank are planning stewardship of 50% of the Earth's land and oceans, despite this being on the World Wilderness Congress website, and it also naming the oil billionaire Maurice Strong on that page from 1987. I sent both pages to some people I know. On 1987 page from the World Wilderness Congress, where all that information I've just been talking about was posted, and Wild 11, where 50% of the world's land and seas are going to be taken into stewardship under the UN, which of course is the World Bank. This is the whole point. So let's first get into how this started. I made a comment on the Australian bushfires, and I said that it wasn't to do with climate change. It was to do with leaving the undergrowth unmanaged. Those forests weren't managed. This is common knowledge. Also, you've got a huge problem because you've got a water shortage. Yes, the water was sold a long time ago in New South Wales and is now owned by a Chinese company. Therefore, Australians are in drought. Australia is in drought, and they have been told not to flush their toilets and wash their cars. However, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water are being poured on the fires that have been created on the back of these principles that we're talking about. This is just a management concept. So I said all this, paraphrased of course, and then I get this reply back. This is before I was told that I thought that Elvis lived on the far side of the moon. I was a Brexiteer and Boris Johnson's best friend. This fellow called Adrian Flynn says, those species didn't go round. Oh, I said, sorry, I'll get to his in a minute. Let me just scroll down here. I said, those species didn't go round lighting fires. The fires are deliberate. Many people have been prosecuted for lighting fires. And this is very similar to what's happening in California. And then I went on to say that rewilding was a land grab. And I went on to the 50% of the earth and oceans effectively privatised through the UN this year, all run through the World Bank, through the Global Environmental Facility. And then I said, I will explain it in 5 minutes. It's a business plan and asset control system started by an oil billionaire who created the Rio Conference in '92, a business plan called Sustainable Development. It came out of the need to control and manage population using environmentalism. Interesting idea, but it denies property rights and puts world populations into cities, hence the massive high-density flats being built around the world. I can send the links if you email me, but I haven't got time to go into it here. Sent all the links. Then I went into what was happening locally, how these smart city gulags are being built and why, and how the Haringey development vehicle was to take over 50% of Haringey's infrastructure by an Australian multinational called Lend-Lease, and how this was usurped in the High Court, but also how this is the template for what is going on with the smart city agenda. And of course, you can imagine the uproar which was coming out. By this time, I was Boris's very best friend, and I'd obviously voted Brexit. I was working for far-right think tanks. So, it says, this is the response I got back from my friend Neville, who said, "Sorry, Mark, if you can't see why the economics of taking over the world's land doesn't work, I can't help you. You are an entertaining person, but you're deeply depressing me today." Well, I suppose it is deeply depressing when you first learn this stuff, but I think it's going to be even more deeply depressing when you find out that these policies are directly affecting everything you do. And we're pretty near to that now. So then Angus Cameron joins in and says, "Too right," and unfortunately it enables those types to ignore the role that they themselves play in global warming, so they don't have to do anything to avert the problem. God forbid they should walk when they can drive, eat more vegetarian foods than meat, ban cars in city centres, use sustainable electric powered things instead of petrol. So this person's obviously been reading too much Guardian and watching too much BBC. Well, that's an affliction. It's not his fault. But I'm very polite with these people. I never get angry with them. In fact, what I do is very interesting, and it's a good strategy. Throw a lot of stuff in at the beginning and make it sound as though you are really having a go at them. Then as it goes on, get more and more polite. It's very, very funny to see the reactions, because as you get more polite, they get more and more angry. It's very, very funny. But none of this is what I said, of course. I mean, they completely misinterpreted everything I said. By this time, I'd explained how global goes to local, how it's implemented through Agenda 21 local action plan. I gave them link after link after link, all, of course, ignored. So I said to Neville, Maurice Strong was an interesting bloke. He died in China. He was involved in the oil for aid scandal, oil for food scandal. The term sustainable development came from a document called Our Common Future in 1987. Maurice organised the first Wilderness Conference in 87 and Rio Conference and the UN CED in 92, which was another name for the Rio Conference because there were several meetings there, of course. And Maurice, being a clever boy, controlled the opposition. He wanted to get the world's media spotlight on this, so he actually employed 20,000 activists to protest for his cause. Very clever move. Another thing we have to remember about Maurice Strong was that he owned a 200,000-acre ranch in Colorado called the Baca Ranch, where he invited world leaders and useful idiots in the form of gurus, etc., and they all were into the new globalization religion, the Gaia Earth religion. Now, Maurice and his wife Hannah entertained all of these dignitaries at their 200,000-acre ranch. Maurice, though, couldn't help himself. Being a really, really strict environmentalist, but a businessman at heart, he decided to privatise the entire water supply of that part of Colorado, 200,000 acres of water, which was running onto other people's land and used to irrigate farms. So Maurice decided to privatise the water. He was found out. He was then kicked out of Canada, ended up in China where he died. Move forward 30, 40 years. Now we've got Mr. Soros doing exactly the same thing, slightly different agenda. In actual fact, if you ask me who I'd rather meet Maurice Strong than Mr. Soros. I think Maurice Strong was a much more entertaining character, and that's where maybe Neville, my friend, is right. I prefer entertaining characters. But let's carry on with this. But basically, I said it outlines the new global management system. They then set up the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 1998, to keep the business in-house with their own lobbyists. Very important, this, because when they quote the 97%, they're talking about the IPCC, which is a lobbying organisation. The whole purpose of the IPCC was to prove that anthropogenic global warming and human emissions were a cause of global warming. That's why it was set up. It wasn't set up as a scientific body. It was set up as the super agency which was needed in the document Our Common Future in 1987. It clearly says so. And in our talks, I give you all of the quotes. There's no secrets here. It's basically a control and management system of all land, people, property and assets under the UN and World Bank. This is what I said to Neville. The World Bank is trustee of the Global Environmental Facility. In other words, the World Bank carries out the wishes of the Global Environmental Facility. It has power over the World Bank as trustee. Basically, the trustee holds the assets. The trustee has to administer the assets and make sure that the assets are administered properly. In other words, you get people into debt through renewables, and when they can't pay it back and the renewables fail, you call in the debt. And of course, there's interest on that. That's how banks make money. There's nothing very complicated about this, and I don't understand why this friend of mine said that if I can't see the economics of it, then I've got a problem. Of course, Mark Carney is now the head of this new World Bank scheme. It's a great business plan, I said, but very bad for the likes of us. I wasn't very arrogant. I was very inclusive, very vibrant and very diverse. And then I said, check out George Hunt, Unsaid, The Elite Plan Well Ahead. We've done a show on that, and it's called The Man Who Saw the Future. When I linked that onto the thread, this other person, this Adrian Flynn, said, Spreaker is not an accredited platform. It's a place where people like you publish their opinions. So he hadn't actually looked at the video of George Hunt, who was actually there. He hadn't actually listened to the quotes and the recordings, the like of which I played at the beginning of the show, that David Lang, the investment banker, talking about him as cannon fodder. But of course, that's nothing like the sort of thing that they want to hear. So, after explaining the usage of water, putting out fires in Australia, the arson charges against nearly 200, the privatisation of their water supply, the land clearances and more, the entitled middle-class Guardian reading victims still resort to appeals to authority. Right, so here we go. So your ignorance dictates that it's a conspiracy theory. Wildfires in the outback occur without human intervention, said I. When everything is that dry, even a rock falling can cause a spark. Okay? So they're trying to say that fires are caused naturally. I never disputed that, yeah? So Neville says, what do you mean an oil billionaire? If so, who and why does he or she want to own 50% of the world? And since when have the nations that own that land offered them for sale? Now, I have to repeat this because it's unbelievable that after seeing all that information that he could come to this conclusion. They say they want to create wilderness. Where's the cash profit in that? Is he or she looking to build a giant parking lot to rent Elon Musk to store for his unbought Teslas? Not really very funny, that joke at the end. Really, not good stuff. Then this other guy goes, this is the beginning of it, yeah? This is absolutely hilarious now. Adrian Flynn comes in and says, Nev, the guy obviously voted Brexit. It's useless to use logic with him. And then he goes, you voted Brexit. You can't logically defend that idiocy either. Now, nowhere has it been published or said that I voted Brexit. I've never said that I voted Brexit, and he has no reference to anywhere that I've said I voted Brexit. Because I came up with what he thinks is a conspiracy theory, all of a sudden I voted Brexit. Now, he kept going on about this, and he wouldn't leave it alone. It was absolutely incredible. So, I sent them a PDF of the fraud by the IPCC, by their own panellists, and an assessment of the fires by a scientist in Australia that it couldn't be their vengeful and jealous god CO2. All to no avail. They blanked that and carry on with the ad hominems. I then sent them something from LaRouche. I carried on. This was an experiment, you see, ladies and gentlemen, and we're always looking for solutions, and the solutions can only be found when the public actually start to do a bit of reading and thinking. And that's what David Lang was actually saying at the beginning. We cannot roll this out in a complicated way. It has to be simple. It has to be sustainable development. That's two words that they can understand. It's two words that can mean anything that we want them to, as stated by Enrico Giovanni at the Global Governance Summit of the UN this year. Yes, it's not a conspiracy theory. The UN have a World Global Governance Summit, and they make decisions on your behalf. And the people who read The Guardian say it's a conspiracy theory. So, this fella then goes, "You have obviously never lived in an area where bushfires occur. You are the ignorant one. There is no need of external intervention when the temperatures rise high enough." Now, I never said that there wasn't, right? This is what use Occam's razor, not conspiracy theories, which are always outliers as far as probability and effect. Back to work. Spreaker is not a reliable sort. It is like a self-publishing for podcast. Now, bearing in mind that this week, I got accused of being part of some deep state right-wing think tank conspiracy. Now, I have to be honest with you, boys and girls. I am just self-publishing. I am talking to you at the moment from a phone which has been inserted into an acoustic cube which has been hollowed out in the middle. So, in other words, Windows Towers is quite a simplistic and organic system. So I then said, "So why have 200 people been charged with arson?" I said, "You also supplied another logical fallacy. That's the third in a row." He says, you are providing an uncredited source. Global warming is supported by 97% of, in big words, in big letters, accredited scientists, in accredited, all capitals, science journals. It's man-made and it's fatal. So it's now gone from CO2, global warming, to it's man-made and it's fatal. He says, "Go join Boris in a fridge if you don't want to inform yourself." And that still won't save you, and neither will I. And I just said, keep them coming. Now, I said to Neville at this point, it's a management and control system. The money is made through mitigation, carbon tax, and of course land grabs through debt. It's not just about money. Now, what these people don't realise is the World Wildlife Fund has been doing this for donkey's years. They just don't look at the evidence. The World Wildlife Fund is part of that, as are Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. These are globalist-backed, anti-globalist systems. They are all the same. I've looked into all of them. And so have many people who listen to the show. So I won't labour that point much. Well, basically, I told them that the video made by the businessman George Hunt has recordings of banker David Lang, the one I just played, stating that the system cannot be rolled out through a democratic process, as it would take too long and the cannon fodder would not understand it. I said that's a good place to start. There are then the huge documents of Agenda 21 and the Biodiversity Assessment of 1995. I said it goes into your local action plan, and the result recently was that Oxford Citizens' Assembly was steered into voting for retrofitting all their houses, starting at £25,000 each as an estimate. Interestingly, unlike the big green egos, I can back this up because it's all written down. It's actually documentation which came out of the Oxford Citizens' Assembly that they'd agreed to this. Now, somebody up in Scotland who's just bought a house that's been kind of classed as EPC, which is the Energy Performance Certificate, which every house which is bought or sold has to have and has been implemented for about 10 years. Look that up, the Energy Performance Certificate. It was a sleeping giant, but now it's awoken because our friend in Scotland who bought the house has an F rating on his EPC certificate. In other words, is a person who's bought a house which hasn't been properly insulated and has probably got very inefficient central heating. Now, bearing in mind that these globalist policies are going to affect the poorest people, the ones who can't afford this, I think we're starting to see what it's about. Maybe we are, but maybe the Guardian readers aren't. I don't know. However, he said to me, "You're absolutely right, Mark. When I wanted to upgrade from an E rating to a D rating, I would have to pay £25,000. So, it must be a conspiracy theory, mustn't it?" I said to my friend, this is where the banks will make a killing. The loans with interest will also be used for property grabs. It's a big system. I've got loads on it if you want to look at it. It is why I left Walthamstow, which is a borough of North East London. I saw the plans and also attended all council meetings. None of the plans, including public participation and the density of housing, None of the plans included public participation, which was true. The density of housing was described as nothing like he had ever seen before, and this was the ex-housing officer for Hackney, Peter O'Kane. Gordon Peters, who took down the Haringey development vehicle in Haringey in the High Court, was there, and I recorded it all. I said to Neville, that's global, too local. It's too big for most people to understand, as it is outside their experience and above national government. The idea is to get the world's population into smart cities by 2050. Now they want it done quicker. Hence banning cars in Ireland by 2030. The rewilding is about closing off countryside to the public, and interestingly has just been kicked out of Wales. The Summit to Sea organisation have really annoyed the farmers in mid-Wales. So there are people fighting back. That's positive, you see, not negative. We're fighting back against the green globalists. I said it's a clever idea, but actually very simple in execution, and it's called sustainable development, a mixture of environmentalism and development. It is not an environmental project, though, and I gave him a link to a video which explained it all. No, not conspiracy theory. They were talking about the documents. It was from a UN advocate. Okay, so again, we have this cognitive dissonance coming in, and then I have another incident. Well, I wouldn't call them incidents, I'd call them very amusing, with fake greens last week. So basically, we've got this far that we have these educated, indoctrinated and controlled people, and their minds have been controlled since the day they were born. Remember that the purpose of secondary education is to direct and prevent change in the individual. This came out of a book called Alexander English, funded by the Rockefellers and, of course, the Carnegie Foundation. Carnegie put all the books into British libraries, so Carnegie basically was running the education system in Britain, and that is the result. The result of people going through our present system of education is that they believe authority because they were told to, they've been mentored to. The state backs up their claims. Their claims are then backed up by the state. It's a very simple system. This was the whole premise of where banking meets the environment. The ability to look at evidence that is outside their worldview, though, is exploited like never before. The new environmentalists are the globalists. This concept is unbelievable to those who see environmentalism as a politically left-leaning revolution against right-wing capitalism. And that is very, very important, because what these people do is they claim the left as their own, and they call everything outside of it right-wing, which to the people who are controlling them is comedy and absurd and exactly the point that they want to get them to be at. They want them to be arguing over right and left, to be the virtue signalers, to be the real left, to be the environmentalists, to claim it, the big green ego. So the result is the argument has been absolutely exploited by the World Bank and the thinking of those who know how these people can be used as puppets and, more importantly, how they can be made to pay for it. The result is the citizens' assemblies funded by George Soros through involve.org.uk, My Society, and the Sortition Foundation, all brought to us by Extinction Rebellion. Well, fancy that. The globalists used an anti-globalist, left-leaning, fake protest organisation to implement globalist policies. Phew! Well, knock me down with a feather. I would never have believed it was possible. The result is the citizens' assemblies, yes. A more politicised and radical fake left revolution, Extinction Rebellion, carrying on from what Maurice Strong and Edmund de Rothschild had put into action by 1987. So none of this is a secret, it's all public, and by reading the publicly available documents, it's a simple plan, but it's rolled out in a seemingly complex way. But it's not complex. It's rolled out through organisations which are controlled by lobbyists, and lobbyists are trained. The useful idiot Greens are the lobbyists for the globalists. It's extremely simple. They've been mentored into the Global Action Plan. Now, let's differentiate real green from fake green. There's a lot of real green people who listen to the show. They grow their own food. They live off-grid. They are trying their best to be sustainable and often achieving it. Then we've got the urban elite Greens, the ones who think that putting their bean tins into separate bins and putting their garden waste into another little bin is their most virtuous act. And these are the problem. The people who still read the UK Guardian, this is definitely a southeastern disease. It tends to evolve amongst urbanites. You don't find it so much when you get out of London, hence that everything outside their worldview is Brexit, because I think people voted for Brexit outside London, didn't they? After all, though, the fact is that the big green ego will block the evidence, and it's more proof that those implementing it know their target audience. After all, the social Darwinists assume they are more intelligent, and when they see how compliant the public are, they probably think, well, yes, we are. Just like David Lang said at the beginning, how do we get the cannon fodder to go along with this? Well, you put a nice, frilly environmental tag onto it all, because if it's green, it's got to be good, hasn't it? So making the uninformed believe they are informed is of paramount importance. Arranging their anti-globalist protests is, of course, the best way to get the big green egos to comply. For instance, after Extinction Rebellion shows, which we have covered, look into that, Extinction Rebellion, the facts, loads of other people have done good work on that, because Extinction Rebellion have people on the inside who want to expose them, because they left all of their documents public, including the document in their aims section, which states that in the inevitable collapse of Western democracies, a new kind of governance will appear. And we know what that is. So, for instance, we now have the HS2 protesters appearing. Now, the HS2 protesters, who are now appearing at little camps and irritating people by smoking drugs near schools and acting in an unruly manner to basically annoy local residents into hating real protesters, are starting to embed themselves. I got news of that this week, and I got the photographs to prove it, and I got the Twitter feed as well. Now, they all came out of the Occupy movement, then they went into fracking, and now they're going to HS2. There's several people who've exposed this, but not many. Now, these protesters are the same ones that came out of Occupy. How do I know this, though? Because I saw the fake protesters at Occupy go into fracking and now go into the HS2. Same people. Who do you see on the television talking about it as protesters? Reclaim the power. People become spokesmen for these organisations because they are working for globalist agendas. That's all it is. They're working for their own enslavement. And that couldn't be better for globalism. But what will happen is the big green egos will usually point the finger at anyone who actually reveals the truth. They have been programmed by globalists to act accordingly. They say you are funded by right-wing think tanks, that you are negative. This aspect is the New Age programming, the lostness of the mind, all courtesy of their mentors, the globalists. Remember, we are now in the fourth world wilderness. What do you think the World Wilderness Conferences are about? They're not just about land. They're about ideas. They're about control of minds. As this is a psychological battle, the wilderness of the mind will be created through the New Age, through psychedelic drugs, and through mentoring into the Gaia religion. We've talked about this. The Aquarian conspiracy, the New Age of Aquarius, was where it all started. The Aquarian conspiracy is a book that came out in the early 80s, and it's by Marilyn Ferguson. We did a whole show on it. Lots of people wrote about that. We talked about the mentoring hubs, where Findhorn in Scotland, which was the mentoring hub then, still is to a certain degree, but because these plans have now been implemented, these hubs are not very necessary. They are useful for training useful idiots, but your local council's doing it through the big society, through communitarianism. Communitarianism came in under David Cameron. Communitarianism is said to be a mixture of Fabian socialism and community action. Well, according to Demos, the UK think tank, the new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action. That's where you get your citizens' assemblies. That's where you get your Extinction Rebellions, because this is the plan. The whole plan was to roll this out on an industrial scale, and it has been done like that. Go and look at the amount of NGOs that are pushing this, and all of their websites are the same. The protest groups are the same too. They always describe themselves as grassroots. They are anything but. So, It's the arrogance and gullibility. This is what makes them green, not their environmental credentials. So the big green ego is green because they are arrogant and gullible. And I had a big green ego sort of attacking me or attacking Windows on the World last week. And it was very funny because when asked for the evidence of what he was saying, there wasn't any, but just more attacks come. But this is quite funny, really, because it's this. I'm going to quote this person because it's extremely insightful, because what it does is it shows up how they reverse things in their own minds. This fella says, I've been following the antics of people like Windows and their antediluvian machinations for 20 years. Ooh, nice word salad to start with, wasn't it? I've been tracking the work of Stephen Milloy and Alex Jones since the end of the 90s. Yeah, okay, what's that got to do with Windows on the World? Because that kind of rhetoric started to cloud the debate around that time. Wow, this bloke's really insightful, isn't he? Doesn't he realise that Alex Jones is funded by globalists? Doesn't he realise that Windows on the World isn't? Now, Alex Jones actually did wake quite a lot of people up, if that's the right vernacular. But then you have to start doing your research yourself. And then you have to realise that most of the stuff he talks about and his rants are absolute rubbish, because he starts going on about the occultism of the Nazis and how this all ties in, when he's about 100 miles in the wrong direction, which is why he got away with it for so long. But some of his stuff is very good. And he did indeed have George Hunt on. He had George Hunt, the man who blew the whistle on the World Environmental Facility, the global banking institution, which was to hoover up the Greens and use green policy to take over infrastructure. So let's get back to what the big green ego had to say. He said, it's a pattern of activity that's closely related to the work of strategic communications, in brackets, the dark side of the PR industry, to create fear and doubt, preventing positive action against environmentally destructive corporations. So all of a sudden, I'm now this huge network. I'm part of all these dark think tanks and NGOs. For some reason, he thinks I'm linked into a place called Tufton Street. And I don't know why that is, right? 'Cause I don't even know where it is. But this is the insanity of the fake green, big green ego. So basically, he's now accusing me of working for strategic communications, which is a thing we've talked about a lot in the past, because I explain how strategic communications and the PR industry actually works. But he's never obviously listened to those shows, because he then starts to accuse me of putting out misinformation. And the misinformation he accuses me of putting out is what a scientist said in a debate which went on at the Business and Technology Centre, where there was a little protest outside, and we called it Globalist Warming Hoax Day. And I quoted a scientist called, I think, Peter Gill, who'd been in there. He said it was terrible. They wouldn't even let me ask a question. They wouldn't even let me put any facts across. Well, of course they wouldn't, because they're these same people, the same people that have just been talking to me here as though I'm part of some big system, which they're part of. This is the funny thing about it, right? This could drive someone insane if they weren't balanced, couldn't it? If I wasn't more balanced, this could actually completely derail my thinking. But I'm very lucky, because when I first started seeing this, it was about 15, 20 years ago. So I'm really used to it now. This is how they took over Occupy. This is how the fake environmentalists who took over that movement and started the human mic and saying whose streets are streets and all this sort of stuff. This is when I started finding out how it worked and how it linked into George Soros even then. But that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, of course. Let's get back to what this idiot's saying anyway. Yes, I'm now part of strategic communications, you see. And he says, and as your recent output confirms, it's a tactic that works, which is why they fund it. I think he's talking to the person who is kind of attacked here. Now, this is all rubbish on Facebook, of course, and no one gets attacked on Facebook. Well, I suppose you could try going down to A&E and saying, I've just been attacked. And they go, well, you look all right. No, I got attacked on Facebook. Well, you can get some prescription drugs for that. You know, you could get some tranquilizers. I'm sure you'll be all right in the morning. And anyway, he says, what's interesting about Windows et al. So he's now linking me to all these dark, deep state operations, you know, when I'm actually broadcasting from a phone inside an acoustic cube in a little flat in North London. He said, what's interesting about Windows et al. Is the way things like Patreon are helping to anonymously fund their work. Now This was brilliant, right? This is his stroke of genius. This is an insight into the deep state. Now, Patreon are somehow anonymously funding my work. Now, I don't think he knows this, but when you sign up to Patreon, you have to sign a form saying that the IRS can look at your accounts and pass them on to whoever they want. And also that Patreon is just another globalist tool. Now, he seems to think that I don't know this, right? But the only reason I use Patreon, which is a globalist tool, for basically, because it's for making money. They take money off the people who are patrons, which I really object to. But fellow listeners, people out there said, if you go on Patreon, we'll contribute. And I thought, okay, well, I can put my film on Patreon, The Heretics of Smithfield, which is a feature-length documentary. I can give everyone a copy. I can invite them to the premiere. And we're talking about a film here which would cost, in real terms, about 150 grand. And at the moment, boys and girls, I'm up to about $75 a month. So you can see I'm funded by globalists. I've got so much money, I don't know what to do with it, right? I've also been funding somebody for the last 3 years when I've got no money, who's in another country because she was stitched up by some very nasty people within the British establishment. And I can share that information with anyone who wants to hear it. So here we go. So now that I'm a deep state operative, boys and girls, don't turn off, will you? So what's interesting about Windows et al. Is the way things like Patreon are helping to anonymously fund their work. I think that is the classic, right? Now, that is one of the best things I've ever heard from a big green ego, yeah? In the US, Patreon and similar platforms have been fundamental to funding the alt-right in ways that are effectively untraceable by the authorities. Well, why do you have to sign a form to the IRS when you sign up with Patreon then? Because that's what you do, that's in the terms and conditions. I mean, you'd feel sorry for these people, except that they're very nasty and there's a lot of them, and they're working against the common good, the public interest as we know it. It says, now you can either take that insight for what it is, or you can dismiss it as some huge plot of the establishment to deceive you. Either way, it doesn't bother me. Now, this was great. And when I actually asked for him to back up his assertions in an email, we got a most brilliant email thread going. And I got an investigative journalist friend of mine from Sweden, in Sweden, and he said, well, Mark, I think you've just won the debate 1-0 without saying anything, because when he started to say you're part of some deep state kind of conglomerate of NGOs and think tanks, that was where he lost all credibility, right? But when you challenge the big green egos, they have one thing in common: no evidence for anything they say. I tried this out several times over the past few months, and when they have stopped calling you names and there is still that unanswered question, you say to them, can you supply me with the peer-reviewed paper which proves that carbon dioxide drives temperature? Now, that one is incredible because it causes temporary blindness in the big green ego. They don't see it. I mean, really, they should take a leaf out of Greta Thunberg's book and start seeing carbon dioxide. Then they could tell everybody. I mean, I don't know what's the matter with them. They go into globalist, anti-globalist meltdown. When you show them that the oil industry funds their fake Green Deal, they then block you. When you ask them for proof that you have links to their imaginary network of industry insiders, you ask them for proof of it. They say, you voted Brexit. They say, you probably think Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon. They say, you probably voted Trump. Well, on the balance of probabilities and in view of the facts, you're still wrong. Because Adrian Flynn, the man who said I voted Brexit and thinks that Boris Johnson is my best friend, sorry to inform you, Adrian, I'm not on the electoral register. They've been taught by the globalists to lie to get their own way, and when their appeals to authority and logical fallacies and their ad hominems run out, there is a long and very bitter silence. So, in the latest Green Ego, as in Arrogant and Gullible podcast, and from my one-man media empire to the network of anti-environmental movements around the world, this is indeed Windows on the World, coming to you from Windows Towers, from a secret location in some big organisation with security guards on the door and some very shadowy people. Yes, I've got the men in black outside the door, and I'm going to be limousined home in the back of a blacked out Humvee. Yes, boys and girls, it's tough at the top. Actually, I've got a 20. No, I think it's actually a Euro 4. I can just about go into London in it. I've got a Mitsubishi, which I bought in Enfield for 800 quid. See, the thing is, I'm just a venture capitalist, really. So this sort of stuff is comedy gold. Yes, I am at Windows Towers communicating with those trying to overthrow the environmental movement. Well, actually, I am, and I'm definitely anti-globalist. So let's also have a look at what this idiot said to finish off with. Whether you realise it or not, that is what you have become. He's talking to me. That is what you've become part of. Yeah, by Patreon, because I'm funded anonymously through Patreon, you know. That is why your work is of interest to me. Your place in that trophic network, not so much your content specifically, because he thinks my content's rubbish, obviously. What you're peddling is a derivative dialogue of the US alt-right. Has he ever listened to any of my shows? Centred around the denial of environmental science and research. No, it's actually centred around the presentation of environmental science and research. At the core of that is a neoliberal campaign which seeks to negate public rights and freedoms in order to enable profit-taking, rent-seeking by industrial and financial lobbies. Okay, I think that's sort of enough on that, but let's just get through this. I was going to get on to Mark Carney, but we're very nearly to the end of the show. So I'll say, this is great. You're going to love this one. This is the Big Green Ego. I'm going to quote some more from him. More pointedly, I would say that you're peddling FUD in capital. Hey, do you know what that is, FUD? It's fear, uncertainty and doubt. Now, that does sound like a sort of MOD term, doesn't it, off a sort of GCHQ slideshow? So maybe I am dealing with an globalist agent of the state. He says, more pointedly, I would say that you're peddling FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt, as part of a more general arm's-length campaign by elite and corporate interests to prevent any change to the neoliberal status quo. Thing is, you may not be aware of that because you're merely copying the work of people nearer to the heart of those networks, who are intently aware of their purpose and actively working within the sphere of their operations. And then he goes on to take some moral high ground. What differentiates us is the underlying thread of nihilism in your work and the fear of the modern world from which it stems. And it's disabling to the public rather than enabling change. Oh, enabling change. I think I heard that at the Global Governance Summit this year. Enablers of global governance. Enabling change. I wonder who put that into his highly inactive and minuscule brain. Because isn't that what these people from these funded NGOs say? Enabling change. Well, we are enabling change, boys and girls, because we're exposing the deep, dark heart of the environmental system. Oops, the C word, yes, change. Now that does sound, doesn't it, like the language of the World Global Governance Summit? Yes, it certainly does. So the climate mobilisation is a beneficiary of Extinction Rebellion. Look up the climate mobilisation. They get 5% of Extinction Rebellion's takings. Yes, so it's kind of strange, isn't it, when you get these fake Greens who point the finger in such a ridiculous way, it backfires completely. And that's what's happened here. That's why I thought I'd share it with you, because it nips things in the bud. So what I did say to the Big Green Ego, and all to the Big Green Egos out there, I said, all my own research is backed up entirely by fact and references. The concepts behind it are well reported on our shows. It's shameful that you deride people who you know nothing about and spout media-driven corporate lies and then accuse those calling it out as doing the same. Incidentally, can you supply a peer-reviewed paper which proves that CO2 drives global temperature? Silence. The Big Green Ego failed to supply any evidence for his assertions, but like they all do, wanted to keep on arguing. It's best to let them stew in their own carbon footprint while listening to Sir David Attenborough. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Climate and economic emergency. Yes, let's get on to the Citizens' Assembly. Miles Allen was one of the people who I sent back to the Big Green Ego, because the Big Green Ego was stating that there was a climate change win in a court case in America. Well, actually, it was a loss, because elements of San Francisco government decided to take on the fossil fuel industry. They took them to court, and Miles Allen presented evidence on their behalf. Who's Miles Allen? He was the special advisor to the Citizens' Assembly on climate change in Oxford, where people were steered into voting to retrofit their houses up to £25,000 for starters. They were also convinced to give up cars, and they were told that they should stop eating meat and the rest of it. Stop flying, of course. Stop doing anything which means you have freedom. So, Miles Allen was rebuked by the judge in that case. I think it was 2018. Have a look at it. It's on Climate Depot, which is, of course, a right-wing think tank. Well, it's actually a website run by people we know, who are very honest, and we've met them, so I would vouch for them. Climate Depot, climate alarmists get bloody nose. I sent it to him. I don't think he opened that one, the Big Green Ego. But in that, the judge rebuked Miles Allen, the climate modeller for the UN IPCC, as giving very skewed and inaccurate information to the court. Because the judge said, how many parts per million, Mr. Allen, are there of CO2 in the atmosphere? Miles Allen said 0.04 of 0.04% is man-made. The judge said, Mr. Allen, you have made it look as though there are 10,000 parts per million. Mr. Allen replied, yes, Your Honour, I'm sorry, yes, I have. That's a great admission, isn't it? Also, Mr. Allen was rebuked for showing a sharp upturn in temperature, which was proven to be false. If this was a criminal case, Mr. Allen could have been thrown into the cells and charged with perverting the course of justice. However, it didn't really matter, because the big globalist Greens lost the case. Now, this is absolute fact. This absolutely happened. So, this is our response to the Big Green Egos. Basically, you're voting for your own financial ruin. We've had our conspiracy theories backed up this week by listeners, and we've got it written down from Oxford City Council. This is going to be rolled out all over the country. The globalist fake Greens want you in their smart cities with no transport, eating GM, globalist poisoned food, stripped of nutrients on a slave diet. Yes, that's what they want. And listening to the fake Green Party and fiends of the earth, two globalist corporate entities lobbying with the World Bank to take over the world, you can see this is so, because these are lobbying organisations for global governance, nothing more. These are the facts, and the facts are there for all those to see. So, that's a right-wing conspiracy theory, according to the Big Green Egos. So, from the banker speaking at the beginning of the show to Mark Carney. So, from David Lang in 1987 to Mark Carney in 2020, who is the new face of the Global Environmental Action Plan. If you don't get into line with killing off the so-called fossil fuel industry through monetary starvation, if you don't give up your financial freedom, such as it is, the World Bank will lend you the money to bankrupt yourself. The Big Green usury scam is the best scam ever. So, Mark Carney, the current Governor of the Bank of England, has become the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Climate Finance. He'll work on the intersection of climate change and finance. Yes, the mixture of environment and development. The fire and the water mixing together to basically control every single asset on the planet, including you. He says including risk management and net zero investments. Bank of England Governor Mark Carney will lead a push by the United Nations to make the finance sector take proper account of the risk posed by climate change. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated. Guterres said the Canadian, this is Mark Carney, funny that the other fellow is a Canadian, isn't it? So Mark Carney's a Canadian, and also David Lang, the man who talked about us as the cannon fodder. He was a Canadian too. just a coincidence. That one is a coincidence and a bit of a conspiracy theory for the conspiracy theorists out there. The Bank of England said Carney would seek to make the impact of climate change central to financial reporting, which is what George Hunt was warning the world about in 1987. He said, they're coming for you. They're going to take everything you have got. They are about to do it. We have reported how it is being done. We've now got the evidence of how, who, why, and what is being done. But if you're a fake green, big green ego, then it's hard to take this in. So the disclosure of climate risk, it says here, must become comprehensive. Climate risk management must be transformed. And investing for a net zero world must go mainstream, Carney said in a statement. So this is the outcome of what happened in 1987 when the Global Environmental Facility was set up. Some 70 countries have promised to go net zero, offsetting their greenhouse gas emissions with measures such as carbon capture or planting trees by 2050. Nothing wrong with planting trees, but that's a cover version. Last week, the Bundesbank chief, Jens Weidmann, said addressing climate change was a job for governments. As you know, Theresa May, before she sloped off into obscurity, actually gave up the country to the big Green Deal, fake Green Deal, and also to the citizens' assemblies. So she gave over our government to George Soros. Conspiracy theory. So Carney was originally due to leave in 2018. He said, we don't need all that, but what we do need is, but the new head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, has promised to discuss sustainability considerations in an impending strategic review. Yes, it's closing in. It really is time for the globalist, anti-globalists to wake up before they lose everything. They've already lost their credibility, as we've proved in the show tonight. But it says Carney is seen to be as a contender to lead the IMF Monetary Fund. Basically, he's gone to this new position, which is much more important. So everything predicted by George Hunt in 1987 and being planned since 1970 has now come to pass. So when we look at Earth Day of 1970 and what came out of that, Earth First, who are a lobbying group for global governance, Earth First bring court cases. I think they were involved in court cases recently in America, the one that failed. And you've got all of these NGOs who were backing it up, all funded through this deep state program, right? And that's how it works. So what in fact has happened is the globalists have cornered the market in opposition. The solution is education in the real sense. Those who can think must stick together and expose the globalists and the big green egos. It can be fun as well as worthwhile. So next time you are in the vicinity of a globalist, anti-globalist, big green ego, ask them for that peer-reviewed paper which proves that CO2 drives temperature, and wait for the ad hominems. Wait for the logical fallacies, and then wait for the long and bitter silence. When they've stopped calling your names, of course. And then state that their green agenda came from an oil billionaire and bankers. See what happens with that one. That gets a great response. After you have been told that you are being funded by the oil companies and right-wing think tanks, politely ask them if they would like to present their evidence on a media platform. After they tell you that they won't debate with liars, then ask them if they believe that Elvis is alive and well and living on the dark side of the moon. Okay, boys and girls, bit over time there. Really enjoyed that, actually. And I think I should play that. To take us out, to give the big green egos a little insight into how this works. Do join me on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Look at Windows on the World. Come to our talk in Saturday in Salford. Next Saturday we're in Salford at the Salt Cellar in Salford all day. Go to windowsontheworld.net. Please come along. I'll be speaking between 2 and 4, along with many other people. I do believe Chris Williamson, the MP, might be there. I've got a great amount of time for him. Chris Williamson being from the old and honest left, but doing very good work. So that's it. I'm going to leave you with David Lang, who brought all of this into action along with Maurice Strong and Edmund de Rothschild. That's it from the Big Green Egos. See you next.
I suggest, therefore, that this be sold not through a democratic process. That would take too long and devour far too much of the funds to educate the cannon fodder, unfortunately, which populates the earth. We have to take almost an elitist program that we can see beyond our swollen bellies and look to the future in time frames and in results which are not easily understood or which can be, with intellectual honesty, be reduced down to some kind of simplistic definition.